wanted to just start by talking about making the case for green schools. So that's why we're here today. There we go. So we're going to look at a few projects I think that Prairie's worked on over the past decade or so, but specifically focusing in on the Amber Trails Community School, which is a project we completed just over 5 years ago now, and was the first, and I believe still currently only, school in Manitoba to be certified LEED Platinum. So I think when making the case for green schools, we need to take a little bit more of a holistic approach. And you can't just focus on any one given aspect while excluding others. So with that in mind, I'm going to use the lens of these 4 themes. So a focus on health and well-being, energy and performance metrics, of course, and then the idea of future-proofing our buildings. So thinking about resilience and adaptability and mitigation strategies. And then finally planting the seed for future similar projects. So I know it's a bit strange to start with health and well-being when we're, as I say, staring down the barrel of climate and energy crisis. But I think we're missing a huge part of the conversation if we don't acknowledge that human health and well-being are inextricably linked to the environment. And I think given the current context that we have with the pandemic and increasing inequity around the world, it's all the more pertinent. So energy targets and performance metrics, of course, are vital, but we also need to focus on, as I said, health and well-being. And so when we're making this case for the value of green schools, we really have to recognize the social determinants of health. So the graphic on the right is from the US, I think from the CDC, but the 14 themes on the left-hand side, these are all from the Canadian Public Health Association. And if we really start to look at all of these, you can see that a majority, and actually, if not all of them, are quite interrelated to the planning and the design of schools. So certainly education, early childhood development, but even into employment and working conditions, topics of food security and insecurity, social exclusion and having a social safety network, and of course, gender, race, disability, Aboriginal status, all of these pieces really come into play. So here are a few snapshots from the Amber Trails school community, that highlight health and well-being and really start to show how a school can start to contribute to these social determinants of health. The map on the bottom right is the surrounding community of the school. Here's the school tucked in here. And you can see with these orange dashed lines, these were a network of 7 different walking school bus routes that were actually part of the plan before the school was completed. And so these walking school bus routes encourage active transportation. And through this, the school has seen a 61% reduction of single occupant vehicle usage based on the number of students that then of course walk, bike, roll, or bus. I think this was in the first year, so I'm not sure if those numbers have maintained. But then you can also start to see, in the upper right corner and lower left, ways that the design started to focus in on health and well-being, and on the top right, looking at even more biomimicry and biophilia in the design. The top left showing a shot of the gym. And what's quite critical here is for years, school designs sort of pushed these big masses of the gym to the inner part of the site or in the back. And in this school in particular, it was really important to highlight that, bring that to the front, open it up with windows so that it really did create sort of a community usage aspect to it, and as a community center, really. And you can see in the middle here on the top, and I think actually, Lorelei, this was a photo that we got from you long after the school had been operational, but where you design places, especially as a welcoming place for a school, to be inclusive to the communities that it serves. And in this area, with a lot of new to Canada families, and a lot that were non-English speaking, this entry commons was really designed as a way that parents and grandparents could walk their kids to school and stay and speak with each other and learn how to speak English and just feel a part of a larger community. And then the bottom middle shows something that happened completely after the fact. We were done constructing the school and long gone. And then this is really what happened after as a result. And we'll get into a little bit more detail on the student farming collective that was formed. And of course, health and well-being, you can't talk about that without talking about access to daylight, fresh air, ventilation, And so this school in particular was designed so that there was each classroom had large windows, 3, I think, for each classroom. And then the corridor wall is partially glazed, and you can see it in this photo here below. That really allowed that fresh air to penetrate all the way into the corridors. And it really had a major impact on students, but also in teacher mental and physical well-being. And the top plan here shows that all of the educational spaces were designed to be within 7.5 meters from an operable window that would provide fresh air as well as natural light. And that's really key as we're going to start talking about ventilation, I think, in upcoming presentations here. Okay, so moving into that next theme, energy and other performance metrics. So again, we've had this conversation lots. I think we shouldn't be patting ourselves on the back for being quote unquote better than, a less than stellar baseline standard. It really tends to be the pitfall of any certification process, but it's why I think a more holistic approach is important. That said, however, there's no doubt that using targets and performance metrics and benchmarking really are tools that design can use, and it's what drives and creates the high-performing buildings. And without those stringent requirements in place, projects just simply fall short and don't meet those requirements. So looking at water in particular, the system was designed to collect rainwater in 2 large cisterns in the utilidor. It's a basement space, basically. And that water is reused for the gray water reuse in toilets. And this, with fixtures, really contributed to quite amazing water use reduction numbers. And again, looking at the baseline, probably very, like I said, less than appealing baseline. And so Amber Trails is great, but it's also important to look at other kind of benchmarking. And so when you look at a 1978 school, for instance, really that gray water reuse contributed to quite an excellent water use reduction. Energy. So there's a lot in this slide, and I don't want to take up too much time going into it, but I do want to say that very early on, the school division decided that the school would be heated and cooled by geothermal, like a ground source heat pump. But there was a really conscious effort to eliminate dependence on fossil fuels. And so the school made the choice not to bring any natural gas service to the building to eliminate any future greenhouse gas emissions. And that was really quite key in this design. So there's a ground source heat pump, as I mentioned, that brings for heating to a radiant floor system. For cooling and ventilation, there are active chilled beams in the ceiling space. And then, of course, all of the contributing parts of high performance triple pane glazing and air exhaust. All of these things really contributed quite a bit to the energy savings for the year. So there's a lot of the stats at the top. You can see that there's quite great energy savings. But I think what was also quite interesting in this is it's one thing to design a building a certain way, but it's another thing how the building is actually used. So in the first operational year, the school used less than we even anticipated in design. So the school used 91 kilowatt hour per meter square per year for their energy use intensity. And this actually beat the national median by 51.5%. So it's quite a good performing building. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that's sort of exhibited throughout the school so that kids can actually learn from it, as is shown in a couple of these shots here. But for all of those people that like graphs and metrics, this is a section to talk about it. So what you're seeing on your screen here is a table from a presentation that Public Schools Finance Board gave a number of years back now, I think 2014, and it was entitled The Path to High Performance Schools. And so this looked at a comparison of Manitoba schools over time. And at this time, they were using the line, which is shown in purple here, if you can see, as the 10 kilowatt hour per square foot. So I've just switched metrics here from square meter to square foot, but for those of you that know what that means, hopefully you got it. And they basically defined that any performance that would fall under this category, or this 10% threshold, or sorry, 10 kilowatt hour per square foot threshold, would be defined as what they called a net zero, sorry, an zero energy capable building. And so I think really what this is the net zero energy ready buildings that we're seeing now with the CAGBC programs. So the blue parts of the bars represent the electricity consumption, and the red is the natural gas. So you can see from the pre-50s buildings to where we were in 2014 with the new schools, you can see sort of what we're doing with that. So we haven't seen an updated version of this table, and of course this is just a snapshot in time, but we were a little bit curious to know how some of the projects, school projects that we have been working on in the past number of years would stack up with that. And so we just sort of tried to plot those on this graph then that shows the average of all of those categories that was in the former graph, and then plotting 4 different schools. So Northlands Parkway Collegiate, which is in Winkler, completed in 2013, which is LEED Gold. Amber Trails Community School, which we're talking about here, in 2015. Woodlands School in 2015, and then École Rivière Rouge in 2016. And although the schools aren't all underneath that zero energy capable threshold, I think what's really interesting, you started to see a little bit more of a trend toward or away from natural gas consumption. So Amber Trails, Woodlands, and École all as fully electric buildings, which was really interesting. So we're in design on other schools, and so we don't have sort of these final metrics to be comparing them, but I do think it's interesting that we can start to see this trend a little bit more. And so how are we doing for time? I have just 2 more, but they're a little bit quicker. Future proofing. So this is a key part of any planning. And so without getting into too much detail, I think a lot of you have probably seen this before. This is from the Climate Atlas of Canada. And it shows, it assembles a bunch of different climate models from 1950 to projections to 2095. And what it really starts to show that is in 2021, there's an estimated 21.3 days that fall into the very hot category. And I don't know, after the summer, it probably was even higher than that. Compare that to 2095, where it's estimated that 74.3 of those days will be over 30 degrees. And then just to underscore the severity of that, it's estimated that another 4.2 days this year were in the very, very hot category, which is over 34 degrees Celsius. And in 2095, that really over half of those days are going to be, over 34 degrees. So you can see that, this is just Winnipeg's scenario of, if the greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase at the current rates they are now for the foreseeable future. And you can see that if we're designing schools as 50 and actually 100-year buildings, it's really going to be increasingly important that we future-proof them. So part of that strategy, as we quickly chatted about earlier, it's this net zero energy ready status. And this is from the Energy Step Code in BC, but of course, the best way to get there is to first drive down demand and look at more passive strategies. It's part of the reason that Prairie is getting into passive house, which is probably a whole other presentation. But I did want to just point out that according to the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, they actually last year said that construction costs for net zero energy buildings had dropped by 40% in the past decade, and are continuing to fall. So I don't know what the pandemic did to that, but it actually starts to become a more realistic future for projects in general, but I think also schools, and we need to start thinking about that. And I know it's not a school project, but I did briefly want to just show that, because I think that Matt and others might start talking a little bit about displacement ventilation and other aspects related to ventilation. This is a daycare that we did that had really, really great, it's also LEED Platinum certified, had really, really great metrics. And part of it was, largely due to the displacement ventilation system. And also, kind of going, progressing even further from the active cool chilled beams to a passive chilled beams for cooling in this daycare. But when we're talking about future-proofing, what's also interesting to note is that all of the south-facing roofs of the daycare, which is, the daycare additions to this historical turn-of-the-century house, they've all been, provision has been made for a future PV solar array. So thinking ahead to what utility costs will do, and as we need to future-proof our buildings, it was important for Canada Life to look at that. And finally, planting the seed. Quite literally planting the seed in looking at this picture. But part of the path to LEED certification for the school included a public teaching document that wove the school's green design features and initiatives into the daily instruction to students and the learning activities. So it was an actual curricular document that explored a lot of different disciplines at all grade levels at the school. And it was really important because it's enabled students to interact with the school facility in ways that they've said have raised their awareness of energy conservation and resource consumption, waste generation, and then the influence of the microclimate on building systems and human comfort. And so the school won the Greenest School in Canada competition in 2017. And I think Lorelei will talk a little bit more about that. So this is probably a good jumping off point for her presentation. But it was really interesting. This had nothing to do with what Prairie or the consultants or the contractor did for this school. But the students started a student-run organic vegetable farm, the year after the building was finished. And they work in the summer with a farm coordinator, and they grow a mixture of over 20 different varieties of vegetables. They sell it to staff and community members through a CSA model. And they're learning a lot while doing it. So I think that's probably where I'll end it. I hope I didn't take too much of the time that was allotted. And I guess we're doing questions at the end of the presentation. So we'll wait for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. All right, Lorelei, off to you.
Okay, well, that was actually like, Lindsay, it's nice to see you, by the way, and Dudley also. I know both of them from this project, and my name's Lorelei Bunkowsky. I'm former principal at Amber Trails, and I'm just going to get my screen share set up. Lindsay, it's really funny because you and I actually have some of the exact same photos. So the things that really struck us and were part of the work there. So anyway, I just need to undo this. Hold on a second. Sorry.
Lorelei, that's why I was really glad to go first.
Okay. Well, I hope to go into a little bit more depth into the ideas that you spoke of. So yeah, just can you see my screen okay? Yeah, good. Yeah, so I wanted to start off by talking about this notion of, beginning. And I first want to acknowledge that, the former government, took bold steps and was courageous in funding schools such as these. And it's a different time now. And I think that needs to be acknowledged because the kind of vision and the way in which this sustainable development priority was funded, I don't know if we would see that existing right now in our current government. So I'm really thankful for that. Also, so we're thinking about this idea of from bricks and mortar to this building of culture. So I had the privilege of being appointed to a school that was just being built, and it really is a bricks and mortar. You walk through the building as it's being constructed, and all along, as we saw it in various phases, the discussion was always around that aspect of the green features that were being built right into the school. So, as a person that is like later in my career as a school principal, I don't know if I would be considered, like a lot of young people in the field as teachers are far more sustainably minded than I might be. And so it was really important in the initial stage. They hired a vice principal partner for me. His name was Fortunato Lim, and he had a really strong ethos of sustainability and a belief system. So, you know, as we were moving into the school building, I'm showing a picture down below here that where it's, we actually did tours with the entire staff early on so that they could start to really engage with the building, see the building before we even moved in. And as Fortunato and I were hiring, you think this line in the slide, who are the people in your neighborhood? You know, we were looking for staff that really had those same values and beliefs that then could translate into teaching practice. So, you know, you're building a collection of people that can bring those ideas to life and bring them to the kids. So when you're starting to think about how do you build it's a brand new school in a brand new neighborhood, and this question of identity, where do we come from? What is the culture of this school going to be? I really felt that from the very start that this school, because of its actual structure in the building, was the place where that idea of sustainability and taking care of the environment and the school as a teaching tool was just embedded right into the culture of the building. And I know through Prairie and the work of working towards that LEED Platinum status, there was intentional things done along the way. But you build a culture in a school, in leadership, in staffing, in the decisions you make, to say, this is a new way of being and doing. So, you know, so often in the school, we would often use the line, we're the greenest school in Canada. We're a sustainable school. We should be doing things differently. So I've now left that school, and I would love to be able to talk to, you know, the whole staff at where they are now, that's carrying on. Just go to my next one. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about this notion of light and then metaphor for transparency. So I actually included this picture. This is my current school, and this is Elwick School where I'm the principal now. And this was a school that was built in 1972. And it's one of the schools in Winnipeg that is built as a bunker. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but it really is that your main floor was actually embedded in the ground. It's in the basement. And there is the top floor is actually your main floor. So when you go into the school, you go down and you're in a basement. And so there's a good collection of classrooms in the main floor or the basement, that this window that you see, there's two little windows, that's your only natural light. I had come from, before being principal at Amber Trails, I had been without light, without window for 14 years. And then I moved to Amber Trails, and I, you know, experienced this world. Okay, just thinking about what this means for well-being and mental health and wellness. The other slide that I just showed, I want to go back. I don't know how to go back. Anyway, I just went forward. That slide that I showed you from Elwick, I had classroom teachers this year that were, a teacher moved out and they were fighting for that classroom with that little skinny window at the top. You know, that's how important natural light is to people. And so I can tell you now, moving back to Elwick, I really do miss the light. But when people talk about what it means to live in the building, it's pervasive. You know, it's something that everyone talks about, notices, and how much people, you know, feel that they need that natural light and as a presence. The other thing that I know, Lindsay, you showed the slide of the design. And I really, really want to go back here. So I don't know why my back key is grayed out here. But the picture that shows the corridors, you'll notice that it's not a traditional school corridor where you are walking down and it's closed doors and a closed in hallway. You've got wide open corridors with glazing that both brings in light, but this notion of transparency where you can actually see into everyone's classrooms. And that design, whether it was intended or not, changed teaching practice. It actually made people be able to look into each other's classrooms so much more easily. And people would say, what's going on in there? Look at what they're doing. And some of that natural collaboration that you're looking for in teachers' practice could happen because of that design. So along with light, there was also this sense of transparency in practice and people really doing more collaboration than I've ever seen in other schools that I've worked in. Beautiful. Lindsay, you also touched upon this, that this school building of Amber Trails, from what I see, it inspired cross-curricular connections kind of at 3 tiers or 3 levels. So as Lindsay, you had mentioned, you've got features in the building that are actual teaching tools. So kids can actually engage with the geothermal flooring and the construction of the walls. There was a whole project that took place in the school where there was labeling and descriptions of things that children would be seeing and understanding what they were seeing. So as Lindsay spoke about the collection of rainwater and then how that's used, the gray water is used in the toilets, like there was in every single toilet in the school, there was like a little handmade student card explaining, like, you might see that this water doesn't look crystal clear and here's the reason why. So when you're sitting there doing your business, you're getting an education. And those little kind of teaching tools were all over the building to remind our students that this building like has its sort of its own curriculum, as so to speak. And then Lindsay, you also touched on this idea that a whole committee of our teachers and Fortunato Lim led this a work where they looked at all of the sustainable features within the building design, including like the change in the lighting in the parking lots and all of the things that they would see. And then they took the Manitoba curriculum documents from kindergarten to grade 8, and then they aligned those teaching tools and the features of the school with the Manitoba math, ELA, science, and social studies curriculum. So I just included one of those below here from the cluster 4. This is grade 2, air, water, and the environment. And when I talk about that 3rd tier, I really think that the 3rd tier is where we really saw the inspiration coming. So you'll say, okay, we're learning about water in our school and we're seeing water, and how it can be, conserved. That's the wrong word. Anyway, it can be conserved within our toilet system, but then we can use that study of water then to go further. And I included this picture of a student, and a whole classroom doing work on Shoal Lake and Cross Lake and places where we know that there's, local concerns about water. So it serves as that catalyst, that curriculum that, was embedded in the school takes the students further. And then finally, I think that was the point, Lindsay, again, you talked about those, when you say you're the greenest school in Canada, sustainability has, that environmental side, but it also has the social and economic side. And so to have that identity, that culture, those values and beliefs, then you say, what next? Like, what's the things that come from, being this kind of place? And you really do go from bricks and mortar to like, this is a way of living. And so you saw examples where, we did have started the first walking school bus within the neighborhood. And that walking school bus then changed and it became a culture of walk, bike, roll. And we saw just an incredible number of students, not only walking to school, but using their scooters and their bikes to get to work. And this bike cage was like testament to that, like just the number of kids coming every day on their bikes rather than being dropped off by car. And again, as Lindsay showed as well, that is the Amber Trails farm. It's not a garden, it's a farm. And good hiring gives you staff that can envision these things, but it became an extension of that sustainability movement in the school. The other thing, Lindsay, this is the exact same picture that you chose too, because I think, here, I'll explain the picture here is really about the two, those were our very first, we had a whole squad of walking school bus kids with these jackets that would walk the trails and pick up kids. But then the picture below really shows that, that it became that kids just, they'd walk, they'd bike, they rolled, and we really embedded that into every assembly we had and the work that we were trying to get kids to influence their families to change their attitude about driving. And then, of course, you look at, social justice and sustainability and those themes that were always so important and embedded. And I just included our Orange Shirt Day. And that was before really anyone was doing things around Orange Shirt Day, and 2 staff members. And then, of course, the connection with our seniors and how this entry commons and this beautiful place of light was a place where it opened up to our seniors, which was a natural gathering place for them after school. And that just became a part of that culture that had been created at Amber Trails. So, I always have said that, like, the opportunity to be a principal and to begin that school and work with such an incredible group of people to actually make those ideas come to life was just such a pivotal part of my career. And the question is now how to bring that into a school that was built in 72. All right, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting. I really appreciated that firsthand insight. All right, moving on to Donna. Donna, take it away.
Okay, thanks. Excuse me. Okay. So, hi everyone. I'm here to discuss the association between the school building's green features and the students' academic performance. So I'm going to focus in on the students. A lot of my research is in this area. I'm going to go really quickly because I really wanted to pack a bunch in. But this is kind of like the main gist of everything I'm going to say. So we all spend a lot of time indoors, no matter what, pre-COVID, during COVID, and it's about 90% in North America, which some people, when you hear that number, it sounds like a lot. What it means, though, is the places we spend our time. And so if we're thinking about school kids, it's on average, when, in a normal school year, it's about 900 hours per year spent inside the school classroom or the school building. And what it means is these little tiny factors inside the school, even if they're small exposures, like a little bit of mold or a little bit of discomfort, they add up. So small, tiny impacts. When you do these exposures repeatedly, it can be like one of the most impactful things on our health and on our well-being. That's the crux of my PhD. I looked in particular at school buildings and how these little exposures impact academic performance in particular. And I also have another background, which I will mention here because it's actually relevant. So I studied engineering and epidemiology for my PhD, but I also trained as a national team athlete and went to 2 Olympics. And one thing that athletes, especially high performance athletes, have in common with young people who are going to school, I'd say there's 2 really important things for this talk today. One is that, athletes are usually, when they're training, no surprise, the air quality really matters. So one of the things we'll talk about today, and will be the focus of the next presentation, is the importance of that indoor air quality to young people. And the other aspect is a little more subtle that I don't know if and it's worth mentioning here. So when you're a high performance athlete, you are trying things that are hard, and so you really notice the subtleties and the details in your environment. So if your training environment, if the air you know, if the air is a little bit different, so on the bottom is a picture of the soccer players in Beijing, because of the air quality, they had to delay games and things like that. Similarly, it's not people who are trying something hard cognitively, so think students learning new stuff, they're more sensitive to their environmental factors. And I'll show you some of the research behind this. So here what you're seeing is the first thing I mentioned about physiological effects. So, you know, kids for their size, they process more air, they're breathing, they're both breathing or processing more air relative to their body size. They're also developing. So what you're seeing is the curve, basically a proxy for your lung development. And when you're in school, you're at the age where you're still developing. And this means that there's both immediate physiological effects of the air they're breathing inside the classroom, and also long-term effects. And so there's studies looking at respiratory disease in particular, but also asthmas and allergies. So the air inside the school, and this is just about lung development, but more generally, they're developing, and so they're more sensitive. And then it's not just health effects. There's a large body of research that links specific building design operation attributes with productivity. So this means that, you know, wherever you're doing your office work, your building is impacting you. And where the kids are doing their cognitive loads, where they're doing their thinking and learning, the environment is impacting them. And especially when they're doing work that is new to them. So one hypothesis is that when humans do things that are just like take a little bit more effort, so not the kinds of things you can just do, you know, like on autopilot, not those kinds of tasks, but tasks that require you to focus, that we're not as able to cope with environmental effects in that situation. So those effects might be noise or light or air quality. So putting all this into one kind of takeaway is that there's this potential for lifelong consequences, both from, say, missing time in class because you get sick, or you know, you get 1% or 5% lower on a test that then meant a difference on, you know, getting into something, which means the difference, like think the cascade effect of like downstream, what it could mean for you for your whole life if you're, you know, in a classroom that's not enabling you to do your best. Okay, so this is a very short run through of like why it really matters, but let's talk about which of the things really matter. So, you know, there's no universal hard definition of what makes a school green. And, you know, just to be honest, there's still uncertainty around like which, you know, exactly like what is the perfect, say, temperature range? What is the real threshold for exactly how many air pollutants and which types? We're still figuring those out as scientists, but there is a lot we do know. And what I've tried to do is give you a quick overview of some of the things we're pretty sure about now. And you've seen these highlighted in practice in the really great presentations. I really loved the previous two presentations a lot. So I'll give you a quick overview of these things, and I've broken them down into air, climate, and site. So air, think air quality. We'll spend a little bit more time on air quality because there's more research on it. So I've tried to put these in 3 buckets because air quality can really be thought of as 3 different strategies. You know, first of all, and best of all, prevent, don't put bad things in your air. Second of all, filter the stuff out if you can. And third, which is still really, really important, but basically dilute it with ventilation, right? So what I'm going to do is show you one example of each of these 3 of studies that show the impact that these can have in schools. So prevention, you know, volatile organic compounds and formaldehyde, which used to be more common in things like paints and adhesives and, you know, laminate wood products, things like that. Those are associated with impaired mental performance. So we want to definitely avoid those. And normally I would spend more time on like, how you do that, what are the strategies? But I think people here have done a really good job of showing examples of this in practice. And in my time, I'm just going to show you some of the research that shows like why we don't want these things in our schools. Filtration is really important. Usually, so you can be filtering, there's pollutants that come from outside the school, like from cars, say nearby, from outdoor ozone and particulate matter. That's what PM stands for. So there's also indoor pollutants that we generate inside. And so filtering the air is really important. And so, for example, studies that looked at the relationship of increasing ambient pollution, the research is very convincing that there is an effect on the test scores for students. And these are test scores. I've put some examples of math test scores, but these are also replicated for like language learning. So for ventilation, this is really the most studied aspect, and I'm going to touch on it the least because you're going to have another presentation next that focuses in on here. But I looked at 22 peer-reviewed studies and tried to pick out some important findings here for you. So it seems that we know that good ventilation is related to reduced absences, better scores on math, and also in particular, if you break down tasks between, say, like being more accurate or being faster, so having a better reaction time, in both those cases, students responded in a I think it was sorry, I'm forgetting the word. It was a very well-designed study that showed these things. Okay, so when I put climate, what I'm really thinking of is this idea of indoor climate. And so 3 biggies are, how warm is it? And what's the lighting situation? What are the acoustics like? For thermal comfort, this has been studied for a long time. We get it, I think, intuitively, you need to be within a certain range. What's important is that if it gets too hot, that definitely, even within the range, it seems to impact performance. Light, you just need good lighting. No surprise there. One interesting thing is a really strong study on daylighting showed improved test scores. And I would say one important thing to note about that study is that this effect was not present for lighting that had a lot of glare. So they distinguished between classrooms that had skylights where the teacher could control it or not. And it was the opposite. If you couldn't control the light at all, you no longer had improved test scores. And noise. There's just decades of research around this, and it impacts. There's different types and categories of noise that I won't get into, but broadly speaking, you can think of noise coming in from the outside, and you can also think of noise generated inside bouncing off the walls. And both of those have impacts on learning. The last category, I think, was really, I love to see the first 2 presentations and them kind of pointing this out and having done a really good job on this, because this maybe it doesn't always immediately come to mind when you're thinking about, okay, a green building, but the site surrounding it really impacts the learning that happens inside the building. And we know there's starting to be research that shows, this is newer research and it's not as clean, we're figuring out the nuances, but it appears to be that the surrounding site is associated with better performance in schools, even when you control for the fact that that might be because of other factors. So we know that green space around schools is also associated with socioeconomic status. So if you live in a more expensive neighborhood, you're likely to have a greener surrounding school. And so this study that I'm thinking of, that I'm showing you, tried to control for that, as well as controlling for the fact that you might have less air pollution because the school is surrounded by green. and also views of green. So looking out the window to your green yard seems to also be helpful. Then active transportation. I mean, there's just so many studies that show the benefits of active transportation. And just circling back to the beginning of the connection between athletes and young learning people, you know, there's just this deep connection that we know between the way we are processing loads cognitively and the way we use our bodies. And so activating, being healthier, and it doesn't take much. Studies show that just biking to school, a little bit of walking really benefits students. And the students who benefit the most in terms of outcomes are those who are typically more sedentary. So a little bit for them goes a long way. That's really it for me. I put this picture in because I kind of love it. It's from the 1910s, schools that were being designed with open air, and like their motto was open air, open minds. And I put this here not because I'm championing this, but as just like a point of reflection that this is an idea that like school people thinking, like teachers and people designing schools and architects and engineers, it's not, some of these ideas are very old and very rooted in a lot of thinking and trying things and experimenting. And I like to think of us kind of on a continuum with that line of like, look how far we've come, and also being humble about how much we have to learn probably. And then I just threw all my works cited on one big sheet, and my email's at the bottom. Always feel free to contact me.
Thanks so much, Donna. That was super fascinating. Thanks for sharing all of those resources too. I'm sure there's some people who are like, screenshot really quickly, but again, this will be recorded so people can see it in the future. So moving on to our final speaker, we have Matt coming up. So here you go.
Great, thank you very much. Just gonna share my screen here. So I'm Matthew Froese. I'm an engineer working in building commissioning. This isn't working now, so that's fun. There we go. Commissioning means that I spend a lot of time reviewing design work that other engineers are doing on buildings, and I also do a bunch of kind of paperwork associated with making sure that schools are and other buildings are built in the ways that they're intended to be, that the equipment matches what's supposed to be going on, and then we go out into the field and sort of test things to make sure that they work appropriately. Today I wanted to talk about school ventilation, green schools, and what's sort of been revealed through COVID-19, through the pandemic, and what I think one of the aspects of the case that can be made for green schools is that the schools where we invested in ventilation, in indoor air quality from the beginning, turned out, even though the pandemic was not a design criteria for a school we started working on in 2011, 2012, turned out to be pretty well set up for the recommendations that have eventually emerged. So I'm not going to read all of this stuff. I've got some text-heavy slides, which I know I don't actually even like, but they're here for a reason, which is that these are the official sort of statements from ASHRAE. ASHRAE is the sort of like North American Technical Society for Mechanical Engineers working with building systems. And they're the folks who develop things like our ventilation standards that we use here for schools. So basically the bit here that I've highlighted is, ASHRAE says, in the COVID pandemic, we think that airborne transmission of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, is significant and should be controlled, and that ventilation and filtration provided by HVAC systems can reduce the concentration, the airborne concentration of the virus, and the risk of transmission through the air. So the things that we're doing when we design, when we build, and when we operate our ventilation systems, even though we're not really designing schools for infection control, a classroom's never going to be an operating room, the choices that we make do affect our exposure and potential risks, even though that's not sort of how we're always thinking about it. Now, in case of kind of new challenges, our understanding of the risks is always developing. But I think part of the guidance from ASHRAE, and they have sort of hundreds of pages of detailed technical information for those who want, and I've got a link at the end, we can act now based on established best practices, and we can look at experience with other illnesses to kind of, have these kind of many points of intersection into what we ought to be doing in schools. And I think partly too, talking about when we're investing in quality schools, when we're investing in green buildings, the reality is that some HVAC systems, some schools are going to be in a better position to meet the guidance for the pandemic than others. We've got some schools that are maybe 50 years old, have that sort of bunker design with no operable windows that Lorelei talked about. And some then that have, like Amber Trails, that have excellent ventilation, operable windows in every classroom. And those are just in a different position to meet our current challenges. So ASHRAE has some specific guidance for the reopening of schools in particular, and they cover a lot of stuff, which is important. There's really like good checklist level stuff there for folks who are managing schools or reopening schools in this time. Just basic things like inspection and maintenance, but I'm going to highlight a couple of things here, and this I think works pretty well with what Donna just went through. The big points, and the points that are especially difficult to change once you've already built a school, once you've got an existing building. These questions about ventilation, about filtration, and about the way we control things and the way that the systems use energy, those are difficult to control once we've already got something built. We can make choices during the design, during the process of selecting systems that are then, kind of fixed. And especially in Manitoba, we have a relatively extreme climate. I think Lindsay showed some of the things about how the climate will become more extreme. We're expecting on the cooling side, and we're already seeing that. We had a very, very hot set of days this summer, all the way from May through to August. We had plus 35 days, but we've always had minus 35 days too. We have a huge temperature swing here. So while maybe a school in Vancouver can keep windows cracked all winter long, in Manitoba, that's just not our reality, right? So we have different challenges here than some other folks do. So ASHRAE's guidance on the ventilation side, here's kind of the highlights. We want to ventilate to ASHRAE 62. That's the standard that applies to schools in Canada. And so that's not sort of an exceptional thing. That's built into the building code right now. The recommendation for during the pandemic is if your system can handle it, to upgrade to MERV 13 filters. There's sort of high efficiency filters above the minimum. And that's sort of the same level of filtration we would do in sort of premium office spaces, or maybe not like a hospital operating room kind of thing, but MERV 13 or MERV 14 filters would be kind of entry-level clinical healthcare spaces as well. And then, we're keeping an eye on, when we're kind of trying to address these temporary challenges, to think about energy and controls. How are we going to deliver kind of these attempts to improve indoor air quality and reduce exposure without excess energy use and cost? And I think that dovetails really well with what we see as best practices in green building programs, including kind of projects pursuing LEED Platinum and achieving LEED Platinum like Amber Trails. So the guidance there is we're going to ventilate outside air to ASHRAE 62. And then in the case of Amber Trails, there's also credits within LEED to ventilate above the minimum to a certain point, up to 30% more. And Amber Trails also has some systems that minimize recirculation and really provide fresh air, 100% outdoor air to every classroom space. So air from one classroom isn't being recirculated to other classrooms in the building. Systems are already built and have been, prioritized through LEED and through other green building rating systems. Looking at that MERV 13 as that kind of balance point between good efficiency and filtration without excess energy use from lots of pressure drop across the filters. And then on the energy and control side, I think green building rating systems have really pushed us to both manage efficiency as well as directly monitor outdoor air. And those are sometimes viewed as sort of being in opposition. That, efficiency, when we're bringing in that minus 35 outdoor air here in a Manitoba winter, if you're not doing something efficient to heat it up, you can be spending a ton of energy just to temper that outdoor air before you bring it into the space. So we both need efficient systems and then also systems that are directly monitoring and making sure that that outdoor air is getting where we need it to be. So like I said, ASHRAE 62, it's already code minimum. One of the big impacts of pursuing something like LEED Platinum design. The LEED building rating system requires an external review of design. So there's an external body, the CAGBC, reviews the ventilation calculations to make sure they're consistently applied. You got folks like me on the commissioning side reviewing operation and verifying operation of the machinery in the real world to say, does it do what we actually wanted it to do? Does it deliver? And the best practice here that came really in Manitoba from the LEED requirements is monitoring carbon dioxide continuously within the breathing zone. So it's kind of typical practice in Manitoba earlier to maybe do some CO2 monitoring at the air handler level, at the system level, kind of at the return away from the space. And LEED requires us to put, if we're going to do CO2 monitoring, to put our sensors down in the same air that you're going to be breathing, down at your kind of level when you're sitting in a room. The CO2 sensor is going to be on the wall. It's going to be exposed to the same air that you're exposed to. So it's a more direct measure of kind of what's going on. I'm not going to spend tons of time on this, just given kind of timelines here, but carbon dioxide is a great measure of the relationship between ventilation and how many people are in a space. So that's why it's a great indicator for us. Essentially what we're sort of aiming for in most green building standards gets us to, and this is sort of like a gross way to think about it, but I think it's helpful, is reducing the amount of air that you're inhaling that someone else has already exhaled. It's not nice, but that's what it means. And basically what we manage to achieve is about 100 times dilution, 1% or so of the air that you breathe in a very well ventilated sort of green building is going to be something that someone else has exhaled. And obviously when we're worried about viruses, that relates to how much virus someone may have exhaled and maybe in the air that's being shared. So there's some historical data here. We don't really have a lot of recent experience in North America with respiratory pandemics. Widespread vaccination has really dealt with measles and tuberculosis and things of that nature. But this is some data from a couple of other parts of the world where those are more ongoing concerns. The top one is sort of based on some stuff out of the 70s in New York where there was a measles outbreak at the time. And this is an application of some ventilation risk calculations showing that essentially in a typical classroom, in a full classroom, the relationship between the air changes per hour, the ventilation rate for that classroom is really strong to the risk of becoming infected. There's a really sharp rise in infection risk in poorly ventilated or unventilated spaces. But if we hit reasonable ventilation rates, we can really minimize kind of that aspect of the risk, the aerosol aspect of the risk. And then as recently as 2019, there's kind of the bottom two graphs here. This was a ventilation intervention in a university in Taipei where they had a tuberculosis outbreak. Again, not every place has kind of the widespread vaccination that we have here. And they did what we can do here too, is carbon dioxide monitoring. They had a portable CO2 monitor in this case that they were using. They identified some very under-ventilated spaces in their university, up to about 3,000 parts per million of CO2. And then they have this kind of dividing line here. You've got two cohorts. You've got students who were in spaces where the CO2 was over 1,000 parts per million, which is a vast majority of the risk of catching tuberculosis in the school was associated with students in those classrooms. And if you had students who were in classrooms that had very low CO2, the risk was also very low. So it's a useful proxy. It's a meaningful proxy. It's kind of the closest we can get to really checking on risk, in a practical way for this kind of thing. And the practical part of sort of, especially the LEED bit, which is very specific, is saying those CO2 sensors, they really need to be down in the space, in the air that you're breathing in the room, 4 to 6 feet above the floor, is that they let us know about ventilation issues that show up anywhere in the system. So if the main air handler has an issue, if the fan breaks a belt, if there's a local issue with the control of a single damper and a single damper actuator on one classroom fails, we can get an alert, we can get an alarm and find out about it right away. Somebody might not kind of feel that or notice that. It might just be sort of stale for a while until it gets kind of very hot or cold outside and you notice the other sides of it. But having that sensor lets us see failures very, very early. Having those sensors in the room also can alert operators to adjust operating schedules when use changes. I think every building has been through lots of use and schedule changes during the pandemic. We noticed when we were doing some CO2 monitoring in our own office that our ventilation on the floor that I work on wasn't quite capturing our more flexible schedule, and that's one of the things that we changed last spring. I think there's another thing here that's sort of especially applicable to those of us in cold climates, which is that ventilation effectiveness. And I think there was some chatter earlier about the notion of sort of displacement ventilation, which I'm not going to get into a ton, but if displacement ventilation sort of solves the problem I'm going to talk about here. In conventional overhead ventilation, we have very effective ventilation when we're cooling. When we push cool air in from the top of the room, it tends to sink and we get good mixing down to where people are. But when we do ceiling supply of warm air, we get less effective mixing. More of that ventilation air kind of stays up near the ceiling and can leave without kind of dispersing through the space. And one of the things that placing CO2 sensors in the way that LEED requires down at that 4 to 6 foot level is it picks up if you have a problem with stratification. If that supplier isn't making it down, it'll pick up that CO2 at the breathing zone level, at the level people are exposed to in a classroom, isn't being managed. And that's very effective information. That's something we can take action about and make changes to effect. On the filtration side that Donna mentioned there, our code minimum is MERV 6. And so MERV is just a filter rating system. So MERV 6 is kind of the basic. It's going to protect the equipment, but it's not going to do much in terms of protecting people as such. The best practice across kind of conventional non-healthcare, non-lab kind of spaces is to move up to MERV 13s. That's where you start to get good management of that small particulate matter that Donna mentioned, the PM. So it helps to pick up, and it doesn't completely sort of capture, but it really knocks down the concentrations of things like bioaerosols, where we're worried about virus transmission. It also helps with lots of other things, allergens that might contribute to asthma responses. And this summer, MERV 13 filters were useful across schools and daycares that were operating as we had wildfire smoke exposures. So I think just to kind of talk a little bit about that, one of the big challenges in ventilation and in green building design right now is that we don't get to solve one problem at a time. Green buildings and investing in green buildings is not just about energy costs, although that's maybe part of the picture. It's not just about climate change, although that's part of the picture. Right now, it's not just about pandemic safety and confidence in the buildings we're coming back to, although that is part of the picture. We also have these issues with outdoor air quality itself. And if climate change continues to drive more of those hot, dry days, more wildfires are, realistically part of the package. That's part of something we're going to have to face. So earlier this summer, we had a daycare in rural Manitoba, relatively recent construction. It was so smoky in their part of the province one day that their fire alarm went off because of the amount of smoke that was coming into the building. The concentration of smoke was that intense. So at that point, you're operating a daycare in the middle of a pandemic, so you want as much outdoor air as possible, but then the outdoor air is filled with smoke, so you want as little outdoor air as possible. And then you've got your climate change and your energy piece. Like, you're kind of, when you talk to a building operator, you got to talk to them about, well, what do you practically do when you have a building full of staff and full of kids in the middle of a pandemic, also in the middle of a wildfire? And we need to build systems that people can rely on to meet these various challenges and find a reasonable balance all at the same time, where we can say, we've got a system that's built right to deliver the right amount of ventilation in an efficient and effective way into the space to get to people, and also one that's got good quality filters so that on those days when we have poor outdoor air quality, we've got the ability to filter out at least a reasonable fraction of those kind of particulates and let people continue to live their lives in a safe and effective way. We want to be using these buildings to kind of set that stage for educators and for students to do their best. And part of, I think, that work is, all of us in the building industry setting things up so that people don't have to think about it as much, making sure that we've got these systems in place so that the ventilation is already there, the sensors are already there, the filters are already there, and the capacity to run good filters is already there, without having to kind of scramble the next time a challenge comes. And I think I'm not going to spend too much time on this because Donna did a better job, and I think we even have one of the same stats here. But at the end of the day, if we invest in great indoor air quality and systems that deliver it, maybe because we're driven by the pandemic right now, or maybe for other reasons, if the worst thing that happens is we start to get more students in class for more of the time, decreased illness in students and staff, I mean, it's a win. It's a win all across the board. And it does take some investment, but it's the kind of thing that pays off in the long term in ways that we might not anticipate. And we didn't anticipate with Amber Trails. I don't think my design reviews there had any notions about the pandemic or respiratory illnesses, but I think it's a building that's really well equipped to meet the ASHRAE guidelines for reopening and for operation during the pandemic. So I've got a couple of links here to some of the related resources. So the first is the ASHRAE School Reopening Guidelines. There's a lot of stuff there. They also have a one-pager summary if you want something kind of short to hand off to somebody. There's a link there on the Lancet COVID-19 Commission. They have a paper about designing infectious disease resilience into schools through ventilation and air filtration. And there's a lot of really smart people who contributed to that. It's a great document. And there's one thing I'm excited about taking in towards the end of October. It's the International Society of Indoor Air Quality webinar, Managing Buildings in the Era of COVID-19. So if anyone is interested in the topic of CO2 monitoring and air cleaners, which is a somewhat controversial topic in some quarters, there will be some super smart people talking about it, and I am looking forward to that.
All right, well, this is great. Thank you so much for your time here. So if anybody has any questions, if anybody has any for Donna, she's got to go very, very soon, pretty much pronto. So let's start there. Okay. So, so no specific questions for Donna. So Donna, no worries if you've got to go. I hear you.
Yeah, sorry everyone. I'm running my kids to daycare. I've been really appreciating all the other speakers, and I would love to connect with you all offline. And yeah, and if anyone has any questions for me, because I'm running away, and even if I wasn't, please feel free to reach out on LinkedIn or via email, and I'll put my email in the chat too.
Great, thank you so much. Really appreciate all that you shared here today. All right, so rather than me trying to read the questions, I'm just going to call on who's got a question. So we're going to start with you first there, Mike, if you want to go. And just before you start, Mike, just if anybody has to go, we know that it's past 1, and so no worries. Don't feel bad about it. We will record this and you can catch it later. So thanks for being here. All right, Mike, take it away.
Thank you, Laura. So firstly, I'd like to thank Lindsay, Matt, and Lorelei for their excellent presentations, as well as Donna, who just left. But how much more or less feasible do you think it would be to try to retrofit existing schools in Winnipeg, the existing buildings, rather than demolishing and replacing them?
That is a very, very good question, Mike. I don't know. I'm sure Matt will have more opinions from a technical side of things and ventilation and systems wise. But I think personally, for too long, we've talked about sustainability in terms of having a green building and it has to be new, and having adaptive reuse of existing structures in 2 separate categories. And that really quick slide I showed of the daycare for Canada Life building blocks on Balmoral is a great example of how they're not mutually exclusive. That is a LEED Platinum building of an existing turn of the century building that was really slated for demolition. And it is a early childhood development center for over 100 kids in a really, all of the things that we're talking about today have been done and implemented there. So I don't think it's impossible. Is it hard? Yes. Does it take work? Absolutely. But it also just takes the right people around the table and the right desire to get it done. And I think Lorelei even sort of touched on that a little bit with the existing schools. That's what people want, right? That's what we're all trying to find the light. And we want to be in healthy places. So I think it's an important aspect of sustainability. And increasingly we've got an existing building stock that we have to start addressing. We cannot just be looking at having new schools address this. It's driving a further wedge between the haves and the have-nots in our society, let alone in our school, and it's not appropriate. So we have to focus on existing buildings.
Can I make a comment? Can I make a comment to what you just said, Lindsay? It's really interesting that you would say that directly, because I've gone from Amber Trails, which is, you know, a really beautiful brand new school in a very affluent neighborhood, to within Seven Oaks, the school that's probably got the greatest socioeconomic challenges. And that is more like pronounced and evident in my mind than, you know, I started my career in Seven Oaks at Elwick School. But coming from Amber Trails and then to see this building, like, I know they've done a lot to try to upgrade it, but it's just so interesting to me that the children that are living in some of the most challenging circumstances have the actual, you know, one of the most compromised buildings in the whole division, right? So.
Anything else to add, anyone? All right. So moving on to Corey. Corey, do you want to say your question?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I'll read my own question. That's no problem. So, I mean, in Manitoba, we have a green building policy that was sort of, it's a, you know, a regulation, a policy that's run, or I guess it's, you know, it's our government that sort of enforces that sort of thing. It covers public school design. It has obviously some influence on the design. It includes things like water conservation, energy efficiency targets, that kind of stuff, all the things that everyone spoke about here. But it's old now. It's like due to be updated. And I think it is actively being updated. I'm just curious if those of you who have designed buildings or who have commissioned existing or, you know, newly constructed buildings can think of something specifically that should be added or omitted or changed from that. And I'm curious specifically about the potential removal of LEED certification from that policy, just because I have a feeling that's something that's being discussed. Whoever wants to go first, go for it.
If I can jump in on that, I think, you know, the value of LEED, I think, is especially sort of depends on your perspective and your experience. And I think that because LEED asks very different things of different players in the building industry. So some people don't interact with it much at all. For some people, they just kind of send paperwork off and they never really know what it means. But it has really impacted elements of the way that ventilation design and review happen in Manitoba. And there's some on the ventilation and air quality side in particular, it has been influential. It has really changed the way that we do some things, and the effectiveness of how we do CO2 monitoring is one example. Having external reviewers for ventilation calculations is a very niche concern, but it has changed the way that part of the industry functions in Manitoba. And so I wouldn't want to let go of all of that, certainly. I think there are some ways, like I know ASHRAE is working on a new guideline. It's not out yet, but it's in review, draft review. Guideline 42 for enhanced indoor air quality will pick up a bunch of that stuff. But at some point too, it is sometimes helpful to have external review as a pressure on the industry and an outside measuring stick to make sure we're all on the same path.
Yeah, I completely agree, Matt. And although I don't think there's any certification platform that's without its faults or, you know, sort of has a tunnel focus on certain things. But I think if you throw it all out and you don't have those metrics or measuring, you know, performance targets, you really just fall short on everything. So I think it's really critical that as we move forward, we have those things that we're striving to achieve. But I think increasingly we need to have a policy that focuses on a passive strategy. So we really do have to look forward and not just sort of pat ourselves on the back for being better than what we did in the past. We really, really have to start looking at meeting federal targets and worldwide targets for greenhouse gas emissions and driving down energy and really looking at you know, passive strategies to do that, because we don't need to use as much energy. So whether that's a certification platform or it's a combination of a variety of different aspects from different platforms, I think that's important. And I think, like I said in my presentation, it has to be a more holistic approach. It can't just be about energy. It has to be about human health and well-being as well. And if you don't look at them together, then we're really missing the boat.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Anything else that anybody wants to add? All right, we're moving on to Bill. Bill, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. So you guys can see it in the chat, but following up on what Lindsay just said, so Amber Trails, fantastic design, but unless you have the operations maintenance people following what the design intent was, it could fall short of building code, let alone higher standards. So is there any programs or CAGB acting aggressively to try to encourage these people to do LEED O+1 so that you can continually improve these buildings, or sort of expanding on what you want with the nexus of health and energy, sort of IWBI's well certified, which is incredibly popular now in the States because of COVID?
Yeah, I'm not sure in particular about any of the follow-up certifications. I do know in particular though, with Amber Trails and the incredible team at Seven Oaks School Division, that a lot of the metrics that we've received that were included in my presentation are those operational metrics. They're not the design metrics that we often have, is the only thing we have for projects. So the ongoing monitoring of water usage, of energy usage, is important to them as a school division, but I think it's also important from a learning perspective because the students are actually using that information at a different level, of course. So we have been involved, and of course there's things like post-occupancy surveys and the like, but I think the idea of recertification on projects is a really interesting one, because I often wonder how many projects out there, as you say, not only don't meet the proposed design intent, but maybe due to just lack of knowledge or operational know-how, sort of fall off when all of the desire is there, but just don't have the long-term or the longevity in operating the building. So I think it's an interesting thing, and I'm not familiar with those particular systems that you were talking about, but back to Corey's question about how the policy can change, maybe having a long-term approach is more appropriate.
Yeah, I think that persistence, the question of kind of long-term performance, is a huge one, and it's one where we sort of have a regulatory gap. So ASHRAE 62, the ventilation standard, I think the recommendation in ASHRAE 62 is to re-verify for any building the outdoor air volume. I think it's every 10 years. That is not a requirement here. There's no provincial office to check that. No one forces you to do it. You can start up a system and sort of turn off your ventilation on day 2, and really most of the time no one would be the wiser. So we don't really have a structure for that, as so far as I know, and it's a huge question about where that would start. And if you do go down that path, where's the funding and where's the money to do something about whatever it is that you find? Our experience in retro commissioning is usually we get called into buildings that have operational issues and folks who are ready to spend some money to solve those problems. And sometimes the costs are very high. And if there are serious challenges to take on, there needs to be some funding available to kind of back that up and to get buildings back on track. And I think that's been a challenge so far.
Okay, we've got 2 final questions that we're going to go through and then call it for a day. So Albert, do you want to speak up and ask your question?
Yeah, this is a great school. The passive design, natural ventilation, it's probably in the 91 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. Now that's the target you have to hit for net zero buildings. My question is, why didn't it go all the way to net zero if you've done 99.9% of the effort and carbon neutral? I'm going to get off my soapbox, but every building has to be net zero. There's only way we're going to survive. And our 700 forest fires here in BC, we as professionals have to show all our clients that the only way we need to get out of this is all buildings have to be net zero or carbon neutral. And this project would have been perfect. It was all 99.9% there. Just wondering why it didn't go all the way. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And in fact, there's a couple of projects that we've worked on that we have questioned that ourselves. So first of all, it was a provincial mandate for these schools under the green building policy to meet, at the time, the policy's LEED Gold. So that's where the project started, of course. This project, I think for us, is a 2011 job number. So, I mean, it's a number of years ago, and it wasn't designed at a time where we have the current certification sort of net zero energy platforms that we have right now. Not that net zero wasn't around in the school of thought and passive strategies, but it certainly wasn't something that was being driven from like a provincial regulatory perspective. That said, all of the decisions that went into meeting the targets were really from the mindset of, like I said, not bringing natural gas even onto the site, not putting ourselves in a position where we would be contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. So all the school of thought was there. And to be honest, it's one of those things, but like I said, we've talked about this project in particular and the Canada Life daycare. They aren't that far off. They're already kind of there. They just didn't go through that same sort of rigor of the projects. And, we've looked at them and in a retrospective way are really curious of how those would stack up from, certification standpoint. So I think it's a very good question.
Thank you, Lindsay. I just wanted to just share for the benefit of everyone that if this school was in British Columbia and I did the numbers, the solar panels to go carbon neutral is less than $100,000. And I don't know what the energy intensive number for Manitoba Hydro. By the way, I'm from Winnipeg and I graduated from U of M. The number, if it's 7% carbon footprint, that's BC Hydro or less, that means that your numbers are going to be lower than 100,000. So I reconsider opening up that if you slap on 5,000 square feet of solar panels on this school, it's carbon neutral. That's all. I just did the math quickly, but what I did was 91 times 100,000 square feet. So I don't know what square footage the school is. Pardon me, I didn't.
It's under.
So
yeah.
So it'll be under $100,000, which is BC numbers. And of course, I'm using BC Hydro energy footprint of electricity. Manitoba Hydro, I don't know what it is, but it's probably similar to BC Hydro. So I'm just doing my job as a professional. It's less than 100,000 to go carbon neutral and 5,000 square feet of solar panels. And you could repeat this for all schools in Manitoba. It's that cost, it's that low. It just has to roll off. Every project has to just continue. Every project that has carbon footprint adds another forest fire to BC. I think that's the way I look at it. It just continues on. We as professionals just has to put our foot down and you have to start today. It's every project has to be carbon neutral or net zero, or else we're not gonna get through this. We're just not gonna get through all this. Anyways, sorry for the doom and gloom. I apologize.
You know what, this is a segue for me because I actually have to excuse myself at this point. And Albert, I want to really just say thank you for your fervor. And I happen to also be married to the superintendent of the school division. So when you're talking about let's find an extra $100,000, I'll make sure we talk about that tonight at supper. And and I know, but I really understand what you're saying, how it really relatively is not that much money. So I do want to thank you all very much for your time and for inviting me today. It was a real privilege and honor to be here with you all. So enjoy the rest of the time. And again, thank you.
Bye, Lorelei.
Thank you for sharing. All right. Last question is coming to us from Jim. Jim, do you just want to quickly hop on and say?
Hi, great presentation to all of you. Was this school appreciably more expensive in capital cost than other schools being built at the time?
No, it wasn't. And I actually meant to look at that before the presentation. it wasn't. In comparable schools, right? So when we're comparing schools with similar systems and ground source heat pumps, the school that we did not that far after, École Rivière Rouge, for the same school division, so similar decisions were being made. It was a smaller version, a K to 5 instead of a K to 8, maybe 2/3 the size. You know, costs were higher on that project, but relative to inflation and sort of the way things were going, you know, it was in range. So no, the school was not more expensive. You know, there's certain projects that we have worked on that have made decisions that definitely they paid more of a premium. But relative to the whole scope of schools across Manitoba over years, that's where I don't really know, because to me, that's where cost gets into, there's capital cost, but then there's long-term operational cost. And I think that's a whole other question.
I was going to comment that what we see in other high performance buildings is that the high performance buildings are 30 to 40% lower in total cost of building ownership. And those are big numbers compared to the capital cost. And when we've done analysis on buildings in Manitoba, even when hydro is only giving you now less than 3 cents a kilowatt hour for generated electricity, solar panels are still economical part of that to get you to net zero. And because remember, you're displacing the utilities costs at nearly 9 or 10 cents a kilowatt hour. So anyway, I'm done.
Thanks, Jim.
All right, and just want to raise something out of the chat here that Kyle shared, that it's probably worth noting that Elwick School was designed in the 1970s by architects and engineers and was considered to be highly energy efficient, with energy efficiency being a primary concern of the designers. So just back to what you were saying, Lindsay, about how things have changed even in the 10 years since Amber Trails was built, that we really have come a long way, but still have a ways to go. So, well, everyone, thank you so much for spending your time with us here today.